Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware, A-W-A-R-E, are the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, June 6th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government as an excuse, not the reason, for their wars. The reason for the wars is the profits of the 1%, the U.S. economic elite. Aware was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001, and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan on 7th October 2001, which began America's longest war. Barack Obama is the first U.S. president in history to have been at war all the way through 2 presidential terms. The founders of Aware saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but it's in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of the oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over economic rivals from Germany to China. Since World War II, U.S. presidents have killed between 20 and 30 million people for the profits of the American economic elite. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph for the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in Aware, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, and stop the drone attacks. 3, cut military spending by at least 50%, and close the more than 700 foreign military bases that the U.S. has. Russia has 12. China has 1. Bring U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into no less than 3/4 of the world's countries. Stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5, lead on global nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by pro-war people and the political establishment, Republicans and Democrats alike. We'll try to give a better account tonight, beginning with a comment on the general situations, it seems to me, in the politics of this country on the 6th of June, 2017. The U.S. political establishment was, some people speak of the deep state. I'm not sure that's very helpful. Other terms of the permanent government, but it means that cast of people who have been directly involved with running the American government for literally generations. The U.S. political establishment was shocked and frightened that President Trump seemed unwilling to keep up the Obama-Clinton hostility to Russia and China. That hostility, in fact, has deep roots in American foreign policy. See the history of the open door policy and the classic account by William Appleman Williams, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, that initiated the modern investigation of American foreign policy. It's remarkably consistent. But the result of the dismay the American political establishment expressed at President Trump's campaign promises to alter this tradition of hostility against Russia and China, resulted in great pressure on the administration once in place to restore that hostile approach. And the fantastic charges of treason of the by the Trump administration, because it wasn't being belligerent enough towards Russia and China as the Obama administration had been. It has been pointed out that what occurred in the first weeks of the Trump administration was hardly much less than a coup, not because of Trump's incapacity, but because of his foreign policy, friendship with Russia and China. The result was the Russiagate hysteria, which is one of the maddest episodes in American politics in many a day. Those of us old enough to remember McCarthyism didn't expect to see it return, and to return, in fact, in an even more farcical form than it existed in the 1950s. In the important column written under the name of the Saker, the observation was made this week that President Donald Trump fired FBI Director James Comey for his participation in this blatant coup attempt against Trump on the anti-Russian theme. But proceeding further in the face of the coup, Trump decided to send a U.S. delegation to Beijing for the Belt and Road Summit, the announcement of the Chinese international trade proposal, a matter of discussion of global infrastructure, to discuss the way out of the strategic disaster that the U.S. had been trying to exercise, trying to enforce on Eurasian economic integration. The point of American foreign policy for generations has been to prevent that economic integration of Asia. That's what the argument with the Japanese in the 1940s was about, because such an integration was seen as trembling up the profits of the American economic elite. That's been a long-standing bedrock for American foreign policy, and Trump offended the American establishment by criticizing it, and indeed was essentially forced in the first weeks of his presidency to reinstate that program. The jury is still out. It's not entirely clear how the Trump administration will proceed, whether the belligerence and indeed war provocations against Russia and China that the Obama administration practiced will be, in fact, continued under Trump, but that indeed is the issue. Today is the 6th of June. It is an anniversary of an American battle in the Second World War that has passed into mythology for most Americans. I malign mythology because it supports the notion that the United States won the Second World War against Nazi Germany, when in fact, of course, it was the Soviet Union that did so. D-Day, the 6th of June, was the date, in 1944, was the date, the long postponed date of the American invasion of German-occupied Europe, the invasion that led on to the conclusion of the war in the next year. But even after the American invasion of France on the 6th of June, 1944, the great bulk of the German army remained on the Eastern Front, fighting against Russia, because, of course, it was Russia that was the real threat to German-occupied Europe. Normandy was a sideshow. Americans don't remember that. But it was indeed the case, and a proper understanding of the Second World War and the mythology that has been built up around it for American propaganda purposes is an important point to include in an understanding of modern international politics. I recommend quite highly a book now almost 10 years old by Nicholson Baker called Human Smoke: The Beginnings of World War II, The End of Civilization. That last is the subtitle of Baker's book. Nicholson Baker's done a very peculiar thing with this book, but it makes for a very effective account. He came across a vast archive of newspapers that from the first half of the 20th century that was going to be destroyed because, after all, things had been digitized and so forth, and this archive was no longer necessary. He bought the archive and worked through a remarkable collection of contemporary accounts of Europe and America in the 1930s and 40s, and from it produced a collection of pieces from these papers that give an account of the run-up to the Second World War, of the coming of the Second World War. It is an account largely at odds with the account we usually get of the Second World War, our usual account of the democracies led by the United States rising up to smite fascism. The real story is quite different, and what Baker did was produce an account that was hard to argue with because he was quoting from the contemporary sources. The book questions the commonly held belief that the Allies, that is mainly the U.S. and Britain, wanted to avoid the war at all costs, but were forced into action by Hitler's unrelenting crusade. The book consists largely of official government transcripts, newspaper articles, and other documents from the time from that time, with Baker, the author, interjecting comments only occasionally. He cites documents that suggest the leaders of the United States and the United Kingdom were provoking Germany and Japan into war, and the leaders of those two nations had ulterior motives for participating. The book is in fact dedicated to American and British pacifists of the 1940s, who in the book's epilogue, he states, had it right all along. Quote, "They failed, but they were right." And he makes a strong case for this, and it's a case that Americans who live in a world conditioned by the control of the world economy established by the United States in the Second World War would do well to take account of. It makes sense of Appleman Williams' title, "The Tragedy of American Diplomacy." An aspect of that is also a matter of an anniversary this week. Yesterday, the 5th of June, was the 50th anniversary of the 1967 war, when Israel conquered the West Bank and Gaza. Norman Finkelstein, the leading historian of Israeli activities, political activities in the subsequent years, writes, "Brace yourself for a big propaganda blitz. You're going to be told that the Arabs were eager to attack Israel and that Israel faced an existential threat, that Israel unintentionally came to occupy Palestinian lands, as it were by accident, but, says Finkelstein, that's a pack of lies." Basing himself on the findings of all U.S. intelligence agencies, which were closely monitoring the situation, President Lyndon Johnson told Israel at the end of May 1967, quote, "Our best judgment is that no military attack on Israel is imminent, and even if, against all odds, the Arabs do attack, quote, you will whip the hell out of them," close quote. That was President Johnson. On June 1st, 1967, the head of Israeli intelligence, who was in Washington, acknowledged that, quote, "there were no differences between the U.S. and the Israelis on the military intelligence picture or its interpretation," close quote. So there you have it. America and Israel agreed that Egypt wasn't going to attack, and that even if it did, Israel would win a crushing victory. This is June of 1967. But Israel nevertheless unleashed a surprise blitzkrieg on Egypt, What's more, when Egypt subsequently invaded and occupied the West Bank and Gaza, it wasn't an accident. All of these facts are firmly established in the scholarly literature, but few of them are known to the broad public, close quote. That's Norman Finkelstein. At the end of this program, we will have an interview with Finkelstein describing the coming of this so-called Six-Day War, the 1967 war, in which Israel attacked Egypt and established the conditions in the Middle East that leads Israel to being America's principal client in the American attempt to control Middle Eastern oil resources. Israel is America's stationary aircraft carrier for the military control of the Middle East, and that situation was established really by the 1967 war, in which Israel attacked secular Arab nationalism as represented by Egypt, and by the way, cleared the way for the rise of Islamic nationalism in the Middle East, including that of Hamas, which the organization of which Israel directly aided, because it wanted religious opposition rather than secular opposition. Secular opposition was more dangerous. The essence of power is often the ability to choose your enemy, and that's exactly what the Israelis did in 1967. To come up to today, the Arab countries have fallen just this week into a remarkable contretemps in which Saudi Arabia has attacked verbally and by implication, possibly militarily, Qatar, its former ally in the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Arab states, the Sunni Arab states of the Middle East. U.S. policy in the Middle East has rested on an essential alliance between Israel and Saudi Arabia, an alliance between Israel and the Sunni states in the Middle East. Over against that is the leading Shia state of Iran, Hezbollah, a Shia party in Lebanon, and other parties, including the Palestinians. The Russian alliance with Iran, effective alliance with Iran, is part of the U.S. intense hostility towards Russia in the Middle East right now. But the ranging of the parties is pretty clear. A Saudi Arabian-Israeli alliance on one hand, supported by the U.S., and an Iranian opposition, a Shia state, a Shia opposition to the Sunni alliance that the U.S. supports. Israel has welcomed the Saudi offensive against Qatar, also a Sunni state, calculating that it will weaken Iran. Like the Saudis, the Zionist establishment, the State of Israel, views Iran as its principal strategic rival in the region. Trump and the cabal of generals who head his administration have repeatedly made clear that Washington has Iran in its crosshairs. And while serious differences persist within the U.S. political establishment over the Iran nuclear accord, the Democrats, no less than the Republicans, support America continuing to enforce sweeping economic sanctions against Iran and threatening it with military action. That said, nothing suggests Washington wanted, let alone encouraged, Saudi Arabia to move against Qatar. Qatar is the headquarters of the U.S. Central Command, and thus a pivotal staging area for the U.S. wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and the cockpit for war planning against Iran. Bahrain, which is part of the Saudis' anti-Qatar coalition, is on the other hand the home base of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. The escalating conflict between Washington's Gulf allies this week, complained the New York Times, quote, presents a fresh and unwelcome complication for the United States military, close quote. That the Saudis, with the support of Egypt's U.S.-backed military regime, acted independently of Washington in no way takes away from America's primary responsibility for the growing aggressiveness of the Saudi regime, let alone the wars and saber-rattling that threaten the people of the Middle East. On the contrary, the Saudi offensive against Qatar should serve as a salutary warning as to the reckless and incendiary role of U.S. imperialism. In its drive to offset the decline in its economic power through aggression and war, the U.S. is arming and emboldening all sorts of right-wing, crisis-ridden regimes who, in pursuit of their own reactionary interests, including mere survival, could lash out at their rivals, provoking a crisis that quickly spins into military conflict, drawing in the U.S. and other world powers, daggers drawn, armed and ready to fight. No less significantly, the sudden clash between Qatar and Saudi Arabia points to the explosive geopolitical tensions that run through the region and which are ever more enmeshed with the conflicts between the major imperialist and great powers. The reality is, the series of predatory wars Washington has waged in the Middle East since 1991 have shattered whole societies, killing millions, rendering millions more refugees, and engulfing even greater areas in war and destruction. Their cumulative impact has been to cause the effective collapse of the state system French and British imperialism imposed on the region at the end of World War I, and to engender a new struggle for the redivision of the Middle East. The developments in Syria reveal most clearly that the repartition of the Middle East has already begun. While nominally a joint struggle against ISIS, the war in Syria has drawn in a host of great and regional powers, including the U.S., Russia, France, Germany, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, each pursuing its own strategic interests. For U.S. imperialism, Syria is a key front in its military strategic offensive against Russia and Iran. And it's not just Syria, but the entire region that's in flames. Given the Middle East's economic significance as the world's most important oil-producing region, and pivotal geographic position as the hinge between Europe, Asia, and Africa, all the imperialists and great powers are increasingly compelled to intervene to assert their respective interests. The U.S. views its drive against Iran through the prism of its world strategy, including the need to prevent China from leveraging its plans to develop Eurasian economic corridors to forge a strategic partnership with Iran, and the need to prevent European capital from beating corporate America in capturing Iran's markets and oil concessions. One of the real concerns about America right now is the restlessness of even France and Germany in opposing America's opposition to Russia. French and German businessmen want to do business in Russia. It was pointed out in the run-up to the Second World War that the only alternative to the war maps of the great powers is the map of the class struggle. The only answer to the incendiary struggle of the rival imperialist ruling elites for natural resources, markets, and strategic advantage is the mobilization of the international working class against war and against the outmoded capitalist social order. This was true at the beginning of the First World War and again at the beginning of the Second. In some ways, it argued the necessity of those wars in order to protect the political establishment of the Western powers against demands from other classes. Those questions were postponed, not solved, and in many ways are returning in the present political situation. You're watching News We're on the Air, our program presented by the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana about the war news that you're not hearing in the regular media. The last half of the program tonight, we will bring you an account from the Real News Network of the run-up to this 1967 war in an interview with a historian of Israeli politics, Israeli and American politics, Norman Finkelstein. Before that, we have a piece here from David Swanson. He has written a note about the movies. The article is entitled, "When Netflix War Movie Stops Being Funny." The new movie, War Machine, on Netflix, starring Brad Pitt, begins as an hilarious and satisfying mockery of General Stanley McChrystal, circa 2009, as well as militarism in general. Hilarious because of the deadpan, sincere idiocy. Satisfying at least to those of us who have been screaming, "What are you idiots doing?" for the past 15 and a half years. Swanson is referring to the American invasion of Afghanistan and the longest war in American history. Should we be glad that a Hollywood movie can still be made mocking the murderous malevolence of true believers in militarism? Or should we be disturbed that theaters won't show such movies and they have to end up on Netflix? Should we be glad that a war satire set in Afghanistan didn't have to wait decades for a different war in the manner of MASH? Or should we be disturbed that most viewers will not know a current war is being mocked because they either believe the war on Afghanistan has ended or they simply can't keep up with the proliferation of American wars? Regardless, writes Swanson, I recommend making sure every movie lover, Brad Pitt fan, young person, and old person watch this movie. Watch a sincere, true-believing military commander and his sycophants consciously choose to win an unwinnable war, proposing straight-faced to work on protecting people while not killing them, or killing them less, or something. The basic truth that people don't want armed foreigners in their towns and would rather not be bombed is presented here in straightforward dialogue as well as comedic exchange. And Brad Pitt's character, based on Stanley McChrystal, and on Michael Hastings' account of Miss McChrystal that appeared in the Rolling Stone magazine, is depicted as having turned himself into a human hammer, General McChrystal, unable to see any problem as anything other than a nail. His ambition to win a war driving his blindness to the absolute unwinnability of foreign occupations or counterinsurgency or counterterrorism, also known as terrorism. The whole thing stops being funny 3/4 of the way into the movie, when the protests of troops that they cannot distinguish civilians from enemies becomes an actual demonstration of that inability. They kill them all. When we get to watch the general in charge articulate all of his usual platitudes and nonsensical pep rally lies, even if he lies to himself, they're still lies, to a man whose child has just been murdered by U.S. troops, the laughter is gone. Even when we see a village leader ask the general to please leave now, there's little satisfaction in this plea of the Afghan people for the past decade and a half, finally making it into U.S. ears, because we know the U.S. military will not listen. We also know that this movie constitutes the extent of the punishment that the real Stanley McChrystal will ever receive for his crimes. There will be no trial, no legal judgment. Speculation as to the cause of death of Michael Hastings, the man who exposed what McChrystal was doing in Afghanistan, that continues, but speculation as to whether the individuals crashing the U.S. war machine into Afghanistan year after year have committed murder in a futile and criminal attempt to advance their personal interests should end. There is no doubt that what they have done and are doing just that on a massive scale. They are, as this movie points out, and as no U.S. newspaper or television station dares to state, endangering the U.S. under the banner of slogans claiming that they are defending and protecting the U.S. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 23rd week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, now including London, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. Our thanks tonight to J.B. Nicholson for research. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Joseph Cash, Andrew Scholarly, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware, where I'll post some of the articles mentioned this evening. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't: Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, who are truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, David Johnson, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.